Welcome to High Impact Growth, a podcast from Dimagi for people committed to creating a world where everyone has access to the services they need to thrive. We bring you candid conversations with leaders across global health and development about raising the bar on what's possible with technology and human creativity. I'm Amie Vaccaro, Senior Director of Marketing at Dimagi and your co-host, along with Jonathan Jackson, Dimagi's CEO and co-founder. Today, we have the honor of speaking with Chesca Colloredo-Mansfeld. Chesca co-founded MiracleFeet in 2010, driven by the idea that a newly accepted, low-cost, non-surgical treatment could have an outsized impact on children born with Clubfoot in low and middle-income countries. If you don't know of MiracleFeet, they've been tremendously effective. They're the largest global organization solely dedicated to ending this solvable problem for every child born with it. So there's a lot to be learned from Chesca's approach. In today's conversation, Chesca shares her story of leaving the corporate world and reinventing herself as a social entrepreneur focused on a mission to solve one pressing problem. This is a story about following your instincts and backing it up with data. It's about the power of a can-do attitude, business skills, and laser focus on an important problem. Enjoy. Chesca, we are so happy to have you here today with us. And I have been reading a bit about your story and just such an inspiring arc, most recently as CEO and co-founder of MiracleFeet. But I'd love to start with a little bit of your backstory and how you came into this work.
Sure. Well, first, thank you so much for having me. And Dimagi has got a very special place in the MiracleFeet story because it's played such a big role. So I'm sure we'll get into that. But I'm very excited to be here today with you both. So a little bit of the backstory is that I grew up living mostly in low and middle income countries as a child. My father worked for British diplomatic service and we moved around a lot and primarily in Africa and Asia. And I think that really left an imprint on who I am as a person. I sort of grew up with this assumption that at some point in my life, it was going to be really important that I gave back to people, to particularly children, to make their lives a little bit better. Because I had seen, at that really impressionable age, the difference between the opportunities that I had and that most of the people around me had. And it didn't make sense to my 8-year-old self. So that was sort of part of who I was. But it took me a long time to figure out how I was going to do that. I ended up working in the corporate world, coming out of undergrad. I'm from England originally, came over to the US on a scholarship to go to the University of North Carolina, and ended up taking jobs in business, in part because I really needed a visa because I had met the person I thought I would marry and indeed did marry. So that part all worked out. So I found myself in business and I loved business, but I also never felt like it was quite enough. And I loved the people, I loved the challenge, I learned a ton. It was often, very intellectually challenging, but I always felt there was this part that it wasn't quite enough. Being successful in business was that I needed to do something that really impacted people. So I was constantly looking around for that opportunity and realizing that it's quite difficult if you're not something useful like a teacher or a doctor. It's like, how do I help, right? It's not simple. And I was just really fortunate. I ended up working at the business school at the University of Iowa, and it's a long story how we ended up there. My husband's an academic. He's an anthropologist. It was his first tenure-track job was the University of Iowa. And I'd been working in the internet world, and the bubble had just burst, and I was no longer employed by the amazing internet startup that had been, rising like a torpedo into the sky till the bubble burst. And so I'm working at the university, and someone walks into my office and they say, "There's this amazing doctor here at the university. He's in his 90s, and he has spent his whole life figuring out how to treat this condition called Clubfoot more effectively." I'd never heard of Clubfoot. I hadn't heard of this doctor. But this gentleman explained it. He showed me some video of a child in Uganda with his feet completely turned in, looking through the window of the small house that he lived in. And through that doorway, you could see children running around and playing. And he was standing there on twisted feet, looking, with his head downcast, and it was sort of a silhouette. And you knew that this kid was going to be on the sidelines. He was going to be in the shadows, looking out at everybody else running around and playing. And that image just did something to me. And I burst into tears at my desk. I had just had our third kid. The other two played soccer. The whole thing, couldn't have been, created more perfectly. And he said, this doctor's dying wish is to get this treatment to the rest of the world. It's now finally, after 40 years of battle within the US, being accepted as a preferred way to treat this condition. And his dying wish is to get it to everybody else. And I was I sort of was like, I think this might be it. I think somebody just handed me a gift on a plate, and I can choose to step up, or I can yet again sort of say, oh, I'm not really the right person to do that, and walk away. So that's kind of the beginning. And I can get into what is Clubfoot and all the rest of it and why did it matter. And I did a lot of research, obviously, before I launched MiracleFeet, and took quite a long time between that conversation and actually creating the organization. And there were lots of other people involved. It was not a solo effort by any means.
I love that story, Chesca. And I'm curious if you would tell us more about that moment or that decision that you made, right? Because that's a huge decision, right? To give up this kind of corporate career that you've had and take this leap of faith to solve this one problem that you've just discovered.
Sure. And of course, like any of these things, it was complicated, much more complicated than I probably just made it sound, right? But there was a real emotional, visceral reaction to this presentation of this idea. And I remember going home that evening and telling my husband, said, I think I finally figured out what I need to do with my life. Don't know how, and I don't quite know when, but this is something really important. And so that was a very kind of like saying that to myself, saying that out loud, I think was kind of a like, okay, this is real. If you can't keep talking about trying to do something, you actually at some point have to do it. So I then started doing, I'm a very analytical person. So then I start analyzing the whole situation and trying to figure out, how big is Clubfoot? Why is this real? Is this real? And we happened to be, my husband got recruited back to the University of North Carolina. So shortly after this conversation, we actually moved away from Iowa City back to Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And so that was kind of a moment of change and transition for me. I did actually take another job once we arrived here, but I wasn't super happy with it. And this idea of how do I address this issue kept eating at me. My husband's work takes us to Ecuador. We were back in Ecuador that summer, and I saw a woman crawling across a street, and I was pretty convinced that she had untreated Clubfoot. And it was this, it was like this wham again, like, wait a minute, you said you were going to do something. So then you look at the state that this woman is in and the terrible life that she's having to lead that doesn't need to happen. This is fixable. And again, sort of just reinforced the idea that somebody needs to do this. And it was sort of clear to me also that nobody was doing it. You look around, it's like, wait, this seems really obvious that someone needs to fix this problem. It's very fixable. The doctors figured out the difficult part. It's really an implementation problem at this point. I think I can do that. And even though I'm not qualified in public health, I'm not a medical person, it just seems complicated. That was very naive, of course, but it was fortunate maybe because I probably wouldn't have taken that leap. So there was a combination of this really makes sense. It fits with what I've told myself I'm looking for in my life that is really important for me to give back. I think it checks that box. It also happened at a time in my family's life where my husband had, was now on a nice tenure track position. My kids were a little bit older. The youngest, we had 3 kids, and the youngest was 5, 6 at that time. Probably a little young, but I felt like okay, maybe it's now my time to kind of do what I really want to do. And I think our family can handle that. Financially, we were also in a position where I could kind of take a risk and stop earning money and go out, quit my job, and decide that I was going to try to do this full time. So there were a lot of things that kind of came together that made it possible. And then the final piece, which was also important, was as I got out there and started talking to more people about the issue and people who actually knew something about Clubfoot and about the treatment, I sort of discovered that there were a few other people that were interested in doing something and had actually even been having some conversations, and they were families that had children treated with this new treatment called the Ponseti method after the doctor. And they had come to learn that kids in low-income countries were not getting any treatment, and they were just horrified that something that seemed so simple and so fixable here in the U.S. was just a devastating and debilitating lifelong problem for most kids. So they, there were conversations going on. So I was connected to those people, and that's what also made it possible. So it was a lot of factors coming together.
And I remember, I don't remember if you had first spoken to our team in our Boston office or if we had met in my office first, but I remember one of the first times we met in person and you were taking me through the treatment. I was just like, this is the coolest thing ever. You can actually fix a problem in global health. I think a lot of times we're at the systems level, and one of the projects I'm working on right now is giving out reading glasses. Like 500 million people need reading glasses around the world and don't have them. You're like, for $2, you can like actually
Right.
hand somebody something to fix it. And when you were talking to me through the treatment, and you're like, you can get to full cure, with something that's actually affordable. I was just like, this is so cool that you can, have that kind of impact and durably, have that kind of impact and affordably. So I was really, really shocked that that existed, and I hadn't heard about it, and I was so impressed with the model when I first learned about it and talked with you. And I'm curious, it sounds like this should be an easy sell, right? Given everything we just said. What was it like trying to get this off the ground and try to build that fundraising base? Like, was it resonating pretty quickly, or were you like, oh boy, this is way harder than I thought?
I had no idea how I was going to do the fundraising part. And if someone had said to me, do you think you're someone who could raise money? I would have said no. Because whenever I was put on a committee for the preschool fundraising committee, I would just write the check, because to be honest, it was so much easier than going to ask all my kids' parents for a $50 check. I'm like, I can't do that. So what I learned about fundraising was so fascinating, which was essentially, I was so passionate about this, and I had so drunk the Kool-Aid and believed that, just like you've said so beautifully, this was so fixable. There aren't many problems like that where you're kind of like, this is a no-brainer, right? We have to do this. So it became very easy for me to talk about it. And I think my passion and my dogged persistence, which drove some people completely crazy, had a lot to do with it, rather than my fundraising skills. But I really started with friends and family. And I was so lucky that I had worked in places in investment banking and consulting, and then gone to a business school where lots of people had at this point made a decent amount of money. I had a network that I could go to and tap. And I don't know how I would have done it otherwise, because we were trying to raise money for something that nobody had ever heard of and that nobody knew was a problem. And so you couldn't just say, we're bringing clean water to people in villages in Africa. You had to go through this whole, 1 in 800 children is born with this birth defect. And it's the same incidence rate here in the US as it is in Zimbabwe or India. But the difference is that kids in those countries don't get treated, while here they do. So you have to go through this whole preamble to kind of explain what Clubfoot is, explain why it's even a problem, because a lot of people think maybe it's just like pigeon toes, or that they don't understand that this prevents someone from walking. And then educating people on what it's like to live with a disability in a low-income country, which is quite different, although very challenging here. There are resources and there is support. You're born in rural Tanzania with a disability and you're not able to walk properly. Life is truly ghastly. You're probably never going to get to school. You don't get fed properly. You just don't get treated the same way as other kids do, because of the stigma and the sort of embarrassment around the issue of disability. So it's not been an easy story to tell, and it takes a while. You don't sell it, in a sort of one pager and people are like, oh, I get it. So it was a harder sell, but I was really, really fortunate that I had a number of just friends some of whom I didn't even know had made money, that stepped up in ways that were so lucky and so generous and so trusting that I could do something about this. That, I mean, it's kind of, it's sort of, when I reflect on it, there were just sort of a couple of conversations that led to people contributing at a level that if they hadn't done that, we wouldn't be having this conversation today. So part of it was luck, part of it was my circumstances, but that was luck, right? So it was definitely the fundraising. The early days of fundraising came primarily from friends and family, a lot of people from venture capital and private equity who really appreciated the return on investment story that we could tell, right? And when they understood that $500 could completely change the trajectory of a child's life, they were sold, right? That it solved a problem, it solved it forever, and you could, the return is higher than Warren Buffett can ever deliver in terms of, you invest $500 and that person could go on and earn an average living for the rest of his or her life. It's pretty compelling. So I think from a fundraising perspective, this is also a relatively straightforward proposition if you can get it in front of people that think that way.
And have you gotten in front of the groups that are very significantly into cost effectiveness, like GiveWell or USAID's Div program and others, like have those resonated
Yes.
in your programming?
We have been able to. That's taken a long time. So we identified pretty early on that we felt that we were a great fit for, let's use GiveWell as the example, that, when you read their criteria, which are very specific, that it's like, wow, we actually check all these boxes. However, trying to create the body of evidence to prove that to the degree that a GiveWell needs it took us time, and it took a lot of data, which is where Demagi came in, right? And helped us, helped us build the capacity to collect that data and the capacity also to analyze it and really be able to measure the impact that we're having. So I would say we started off with a lot of high net worth individuals. That morphed into family foundations. And some of those were particularly large family foundations, but we got in there through personal connections. So again, it was kind of like half the story is getting in front of people. Once we got larger and we had a lot of data to show the impact that we were having and the success rates, then we were able to start seeing success with some of the larger foundations. We had an early grant from USAID Div, actually, before we had all that data, because they were really interested in pieces of innovation that could result in revenue streams. And we developed a very low-cost brace, which we developed with Stanford, and that sort of put us on the map. And the Div grant that we got came through that. GiveWell was much more challenging. And GiveWell are very, very exacting in terms of the degree of evidence that they expect. And this was a really interesting story, because they will not look at anything medical unless there are peer-reviewed articles that have been reviewed by the Cochrane Review, which is this, I guess, entity in England that reviews medical breakthroughs. And because treating with this new non-surgical treatment that this doctor from Iowa had developed called the Ponseti method, that was replacing surgery. And before, Clubfoot had been treated with this really invasive surgery. It didn't have great results. And because it was so complicated, it just wasn't done outside of wealthy countries, because it didn't work very well. It wasn't cost effective. They didn't have the ORs. They didn't have the medical professionals, the orthopedic surgeons who could do it. So GiveWell said, we can't look at this until there is a Cochrane report showing that the Ponseti method is better than surgery. And by this point, the train had left the station, right? The whole of the US and Europe, most of Europe, not all, but most of Europe had accepted that this was the gold standard treatment. And there was a study done in Norway where someone had tried to go back and prove they were doing a randomized control study on looking at surgery versus the Ponseti method. And it was shut down by their ethics board because the results were so clear. And yet GiveWell wouldn't accept that. They kept saying, you can't check this box. We can't move forward until you can check this box. Then they fortunately kind of softened their stance, and there was just so much written about Clubfoot. And I just kept very gently, and I've done this with a number of quite large foundations, and it's worked. You get the initial no, or no, this isn't a great fit, sorry, and I just kept, about every 3 months, I would ping them with some piece of information or a little update, with a message saying, I don't expect a reply. And if this is annoying, let me know and I won't send you any more messages. But, this really good article's just been published about the long-term impact of the Ponseti method, or here's a great little video that shows what life with untreated Clubfoot looks like versus a child who's treated, or whatever it was. And so I never gave up on them. And I was utterly convinced. In fact, I told a couple of people, like, I'm not quitting until we get money from GiveWell, because I am totally convinced that we should get money from them because we meet the criteria. But I looked at it the other day, and we got through 4 or 5 different contacts at GiveWell, each of whom turned us down and then luckily left. So then we would start again. And until we and it was a combination, I think, of just, again, the persistence, but also really listening to them and trying to figure out how we could answer whatever question they felt needed to be answered to be able to move us forward. So we took that very seriously, like, okay, this is what you need. We don't have that right now, but we're going to go and try and figure out how we can get something to check the box for you on that, because we recognize that, you're in the driver's seat here. You get to call the shots, so we need to meet them. So it was very, very exciting when we did finally get that grant, and that was about a year ago. So it's fairly recent, and I was doing this for 13 years before that came through. So it was a long time in the making.
Wow. Congrats on that persistence. Going back to your story of coming into this work, what I noticed is like you were really listening to your gut, right? It started with this emotional response, and you were able to trust that and follow that, and then layer in the analytics and the data and the research that you wanted to do. But that gut instinct you had, I'm sure has served you, right? Because it meant that you were incredibly passionate about the work, right? And could sort of weave that into your storytelling. And I think that reflects in sort of what you're saying about storytelling too, right? Where you need to be able to tell the story from this emotional standpoint, but you also need to have the data and be able to speak to ROI. And I'm sure that you've learned a lot as a storyteller and as a fundraiser. And I'm curious if you maybe can reflect a bit on sort of your learnings of like, how do you convince people to become as passionate as you are about a topic like this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm going to go back to where you started with that, which is using your gut, right? And I'm a very analytical person. I'm very driven by numbers, but I also do tend to, there's a bunch of things where I just feel like, I know we need to do this. I feel like this is important. I can't quite explain why. So I think I am someone who's been driven by instinct. Sometimes that's good and sometimes that's not so good, because, hopefully you back it up with bouncing it off lots of other people and make sure that other people agree with you. But one example actually is what led us to Dimagi, which was we got the opportunity to present to Google, having submitted an application for how would we use Google funds to apply technology to help with disability. They had a specific call for action or an RFP for grant funding for disability technology. And I didn't really know what the system we needed to build was, but I had this gut feeling that if we could build a system that was really easy for all of the doctors that we work with all over the world to use in the clinic, and it helped them treat children more easily and at a higher level, that this would become a really, really important part of our model. And I had an hour and I went in sort of unprepared. The meeting was very unexpected. I happened to be in San Francisco and they were like, well, since you're here, why don't you come in? And I was like, oh my God, I don't even know what I'm going to say. And I sort of made it up. And I just started talking because I had this deep feeling inside me that this was right. This was really necessary. And we'd always collected data, but we were using all these terrible tools and it was really difficult and was making life really hard for our partners in the countries, which is exactly what we swore we would never do. It's like, no, we have to make life easier for them. We can't put extra hurdles in. Life is hard enough as it is, right? And I talked for an hour and Brigitte, who is the person running Google's foundation, I think it was Brigitte, said, okay, if you can write everything you've just set up and send it to me within 24 hours, we'll consider this. Well, I was getting on a plane and it was a red eye across the country. And I was like, okay, I'll do it. Thinking to myself, oh my God. So I'm like, get on the plane in my economy seat right in the back. And I get out my computer and it's dead. There is no battery and there is no charger because I'm in a seat way at the back of the plane. And I'm like, oh my God, this is a total disaster. And I went to the poor, the staff or the stewardesses on the plane and said, is there any way you can plug this computer in? And then I explained the whole story. There are all these children born with Clubfoot and I've got to do this. And I'm sort of in tears, or at least pseudo tears. And, to their credit, they were like, okay, crazy lady, we'll find you a place to plug this in. And I literally spent the 6-hour flight writing it up and I sent it off the next morning and we got $1 million grant, which allowed us to work with Dimagi and others to build this extraordinary system that became the sort of, really allowed us to scale. And allowed us to raise a lot more money because we had a robust story to tell. So that's a little bit about gut instinct and sort of sometimes you do crazy things. And I think the founders in particular sort of have to step up at those nutty moments. And you look back and you're like, did I do it? I don't know. Maybe not everybody would have done it, but it worked. So we did it. So how does that relate to storytelling and instinct? I think I'm not a marketing person. I'm not very good at marketing, and I have a hard time kind of imagining. I remember the early days, our board would get a little frustrated with me because they kept saying, well, you're doing a great job on this, and we've solved this problem, and this is going really well. But how are you going to tell the story, and how are you going to market this? And I understood that we needed to show the promise. We needed to show what treatment unlocked for children. That the story had to be, we were not going to put a child looking sad with tears in their eyes, struggling to walk. We were not going to tell that part of the story. What we were going to tell was the family feeling the shock and the worry about what was the future for the child they just had, and then show what treatment unleashed. And, how easy that was. And really, but the child running, the child going to school, the child jumping, we knew that we had to do that, but I didn't have a clue how to do it myself. I mean, I sort of again, instinctually, I knew we wanted only to tell a happy story. We really wanted to give the kids all the dignity that they deserve and the families the dignity. And we were not going to use that. We weren't going to use the sob story to raise the money. We were going to use the promise and the positive. And then we were lucky enough to find someone, we advertised for somebody to come and do marketing. I couldn't even describe what it was. And the right person walked in the door, and I knew it. I was just like, this is the person. And she really developed our marketing, what's the right word? The look and feel of who MiracleFeet was. Sort of the brand beyond the logo and the name, right? Everything beyond that. And she's no longer with us, unfortunately. But she really set the stage for that. And I think, so finding the right person who can articulate what you know in your gut, and you don't know how to do it, is just such an important part of building any organization. And I can repeat that story for the medical side, the clinical side, you name it. You've got to find those people who fill in the gaps and the inadequacies that you have in what you can do.
Yeah, there's a lovely way to think about it. And we're talking about a lot of moments of what sound like very good luck, but obviously you were extremely well prepared and positioned to seize the opportunity when it was in front of you. And for a lot of our listeners who are earlier in the stage, I guess for every story you have like this of good luck, you have the opposite story of horrendously bad luck, at the same time. And so it's about seizing those moments when you have that cross-country flight and you got that, lucky timely meeting because you happen to be in town, and having the data, having the pitch, having that next thing you want to do, having the ability to create the role for the person you just know you need to hire. All those things I think are luck on the one hand, but also by doing the hard work and being ready to move when those opportunities present themselves is such a critical part of building a successful social enterprise.
Yes. I mean, you create luck, right? You have to do sort of the right activities, and you try a lot of them, and some of them go badly wrong or don't stick. And then the one or two that do are great, and you could then call it luck. But really, it is doing the right things, and you hope that one or two will stick. I will say I have a very bad ability to predict, like when I'm fundraising. I for a while thought I could figure it out, and that I could tell you who I thought would give money and who wouldn't. I was never right. And, the meeting I would go into thinking like, this is a slam dunk. This is going to be a win. You'd come out with your tail between your legs like, whoa, I totally misread that one. And then, there's somebody else that you have no idea. And they turn around and write you a check for, many, many times what you ever thought. So I haven't gotten much better at predicting which of the many things you try are actually going to work. And I think that's also true on partnerships. Sometimes our entire model is about building capacity locally. And so we're very, very dependent on selecting the right partner in each country. And then they are our implementing partner to roll out and implement the program, grow it to be a national, to have national reach. And especially in the early days when we were so small and we were still trying to figure this out, we didn't really know. We didn't have the criteria nailed down about what was going to make a good partner. And so we definitely made some mistakes, and we sort of, kludged it together for a while. And in some cases we ended up making it work. And in other cases we had to walk away. And those feel like a total failure at the time. But of course you learn from them, and hopefully the next time you're less likely to make the same mistake. But there's plenty of setbacks, and it's easy to tell the story in retrospect because you glob onto successes, and you've managed to push those times where you went home and cried to the background. But there were many of those.
Yeah, and the ability for you to see just what you've been able to accomplish over the last 14 years. Obviously, you didn't do it, alone, but we're so
Not at
integral
all.
to it. When you won that $1 million grant, what was your annual revenue at that time?
Oh gosh. I'd have to look it up, but that was back in, when was that? 2015, I think. So we'd been around for about 3 years. I'm guessing it was 500,000 or something.
Right.
You know,
So this is
it,
huge. It was a
it
huge
was
grant.
huge. It was
Yeah.
beyond what we thought we could manage, really. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
and that's why it was so crazy that they, Google's going to do this, really? Like, I'll have to go. I can confirm that number.
Yeah.
But I'm pretty sure it was somewhere in that range. I think the $1
Right.
million was probably more than our budget at that time.
But so you're able to use that. You invest in a incredibly smart decision to hire Demagi as one of your
Of course.
partners, but then scale up. But I was just trying to find this. So the Give All grant was $5 million, and I think your
Yes.
annual revenue is now over 10, if I'm not mistaken. Is that
Yeah,
correct?
it's just over 10. Yep.
It's just an amazing ability to go from starting the organization. I mean, there are very few organizations that can grow that rapidly. The numbers that we think about in the private sector, they're talking about like
Yes.
$10 billion companies and this stuff. But to build a $10 million social impact organization in 13 or 14 years, that's just unbelievable success. Congratulations on
Thank you.
on
It
that.
didn't always feel like that.
It never
and
feels like that. I
it
mean,
never feels like that. There's so many more kids. That's the problem, right? So you look at success and you're like, yes, but we're only reaching a third of the kids in Nigeria, and we haven't even gotten to Mongolia yet. So you just constantly are feeling the pressure of, but there are more kids out there. And I think, for a for-profit, you've got the motivation of making money, right? For your shareholders, for your investors, for yourself, whatever it is. And that really drives people to push hard and to go for growth. And I was actually just having a meeting with an amazing donor couple last night. And he was reflecting on his experience of doing that in the private sector. And he said, but you guys have just got to keep that pressure on yourselves for all those parents out there, because each one of those needs you to push that much harder each year and to keep growing, because that compounding impact of the growth just it gets you that hockey stick and that huge, it gets you from starting at 30,000 a year to $10 million. And we treated 50 kids our first year, and we're nearing the total number that we're coming up on is 100,000 kids, which we think will hit in September. So it's just, when we
That's
first
amazing.
started, we thought it would be 10 to 20,000. That's what we sat around the boardroom table and we said, if we could treat 10 to 20,000 kids, we would feel really good about ourselves. So it's,
So
yeah,
100,000 total. That's amazing. How many are you reaching per year, and what's the
it's about
total?
15. So it's about 15,000 children every year, or this year, and then it'll be more next year and more the year after that. We continue to grow. The total addressable market for MiracleFeet is about 60,000 children are born every year in countries that we have that are on our target list that we've classified as being high priority. And our goal is to enroll up at least 70% of all children born in each country that we're in within a year of being born, right? So we don't just go into a country and go to the capital city and treat sort of the easy ones, the low-hanging fruit. Our goal, if we're going in to give access to every child. We do 70% because we figure some kids have the means that they'll go find private treatment somewhere or fly somewhere else. And then there are always families where they're just so far from being able to access healthcare, or the conditions that they live in that just preclude the poor family even trying to figure out how to solve this. So we feel like 70 is a good number. We've actually exceeded that in a number of countries, and we're at about 50% in 8 countries. So, again, we kind of pulled that number out of the air and said, doesn't seem like something we could really attain, but let's shoot for it. And, you work at it, you put the number out there, and you get there. It's amazing. Aiming high. Aiming high
That's
works.
awesome. Yeah. So that's 42,000 a year, and you're already at 15. Like, you could do this.
Well, we got
like, you could.
No, sorry, the 60,000 includes the 70%. So we still have
Okay.
to. We've got to quadruple what we're doing.
Yeah,
right?
but I mean, you went from 30,000 to 10 million. What's
Yeah, it's
4x
okay.
from
We
here?
can quadruple. I'm with you. We can do this in my lifetime, no problem. It depends on the money, but again, if you're ambitious and you set high targets, I believe people respond to that as well. Like having an exciting vision, being able to sit down and tell a donor they can be part of solving something forever is very compelling, and people want to be part of that.
And so you obviously have a grasp of the numbers here. What did you do from a technological standpoint? Obviously, I know we were part of that, but you had much
Yeah.
bigger vision than just what you're doing with Dimagi. But how were you thinking about not adding burden to the providers on the ground, getting the data you needed to tell the story, getting the data you needed to prove to the ROI community or the cost effectiveness community, whatever? So what was that tech journey like? Like you got that Google grant, and then what did you do next, and where are you at now?
So the tech story is that quality is just as important as quantity, right? If not more important. I mean, if you don't have quality, why bother? You don't really get out of the door. And when we first started, we assured quality by going and looking at what was going on, right? Well, you can't do that when you've got 400 clinics in 36 different countries around the world, and we knew that. So we early on worked with a number of other people who had been working on Clubfoot for a long time to figure out what are the key things that we need to measure in order to understand whether we're delivering quality at each stage of treatment. And the treatment's very simple, which helps a lot. And there are various stages of the treatment. So we didn't take that much to come up with 4 very simple metrics that we felt encapsulated quality overall. And we had, as I said, we'd had some systems in place that we were trying to use. So we knew we had some experience with the data. So by the time we came to Dimagi, we were able to have a really clear vision of what bits of information we needed to collect. And we were very disciplined. And I think your team really helped us with this as well, in not letting anybody add optional things. It's like, no, keep this to the absolute minimum. What are the pieces of information that are non-negotiable? Those are going in and everything else is out. So yes, I know you'd like to collect information on religion, but that does not matter for quality, right? So we're not going to ask people for that. I mean, that's a bit of a bad example, but people were pushing. So the data that I keep referring to is really what enables us to be certain that our partners are delivering really high quality treatment. It's done in the form of a simple electronic medical record, right? But tailored to Clubfoot treatment, which is the same everywhere. And we're very, very serious about sticking to the medical protocols that Dr. Ponsetti developed, because we're not doctors, so we're not going to be the ones allowing anyone to change it. So having that information made it easier for doctors. So they have incentive to put the information in because they're not scrabbling through bits of paper. They've got everything about the child. Often it's somebody else treated them the last time, so they're able to look back and be like, know exactly what that person did. There's a lot of things that help the clinic flow go more smoothly while giving us the data that we need to make sure that they're actually delivering on quality. So it's this sort of combined sweet spot that the tool helps everybody in the clinic and it helps us monitor and figure out where we need to invest more time and resources if there are problems. So that information, the quality information, allows us to measure impact because we can tell from that how many kids who start treatment end up with a good result. And we can show everybody the patient records, and that's very compelling. And on top of that, we're sort of delivering it for between 87 to 90% of kids get through and have a great result. So, it tells a really, really strong story. So it's not very complicated, but it was a combination of the ease of use, right? And that's what Dimagi did so well. And then providing us with data in a form that we can analyze, slice and dice, and really detect what's working and very importantly, what's not working to make sure. So, for example, if there's a clinic in one country where kids are dropping out before they reach the end of casting, that's a huge problem. And we can send somebody in to kind of take a look and figure out, is it because the doctor doesn't know what they're doing, or she needs more training, or is it because this is a particularly poor area and people are really struggling with transport, so we can provide the families with some transport subsidies so they can pay to get back to the clinic for their next visit, or whatever it is, that you can go troubleshoot that. And having all of that be detectable remotely so you don't have to be in the clinic to figure that out. It's just, that is just a huge piece of being able to scale.
Chesca, I'm so curious. I'm loving hearing all this. And I think one of the things that you said there that I think can be so tricky and is something that we think about a lot as Dimagi is how do you make sure that these tools that are, at the end of the day, they're collecting data, that they can also be really used for service delivery and actually help the providers in their work. So I would love to kind of drill in a little bit on that. I think you brushed over it so quickly. Like how did you make that possible, right? That this tool that you were creating was actually adding value step by step in those clinic visits.
Right. Well, that was definitely a combined effort with our experience coupled with putting the versions of the tool in front of the users, the end users, and really making sure that it was working the way we thought it was. And there were lots of changes made in each of those stages, right? And again, your team helped us figure out that process. We also we also sold it pretty hard. I mean, so there was definitely hesitation and resistance and a lot of questions, even from our own team, in terms of, is this really possible? And in the end, what we discovered was the clinics that were in the most technologically challenged places. So, for example, Liberia, where they, at the time, had very, very intermittent internet and had very low bandwidth. And we were trying to ask them to use a tool that required them to be online to do anything. And that just didn't work. And they enter the data and then they would lose it all. So when we showed up with something that was on a mobile phone that could be used offline, and then, whenever it got a signal, it was going to upload it, that suddenly made their lives so much easier. Now, that didn't make the life of being in the clinic. They knew that we needed the data, and that was kind of non-negotiable. So it made the data collection piece easier. The actual sort of making sure that the data helps the providers was really design and understanding what information did they need when they're putting a cast on a kid. What else did they need to know to do that, to make that easier, right? And knowing how many other casts had been put on, and you score the feet and we collect all those scores, knowing what the score was in the previous one, all of that information sort of helped them be better doctors, and they appreciated that. And then the other piece that I think is important is we're trying to build local capacity. And when we first started this, it was, okay, you have to use this tool and you have to collect the data. And there was this sense that they had to collect the data for us. And we've been able to turn that around and educate our local teams to say, no, this data is not for us. This data is for you because this is your program. And you should be making the decisions. You should be using this data to tell us that you need more money to do X, Y, and Z because you'd like to expand to 5 more clinics or whatever it is, right? Or we need a better tool to do X or Y. You can then use that data that you're collecting to get what you need from us so that we can be a better partner to you. So it's sort of turning the conversation around and reorienting people to say, no, we're not collecting this for us. We're collecting it for you. And you've just got to figure out how to use this well. And for some people, for the surgeons, it's that they can go to a fancy international conference and present on their cases because they can go into the tool and get all of this great medical information out and present, just like the American doctors do, which they haven't really been able to do because everything's been on paper and it takes way too much work to pull it all together. And then the local partner, the local NGO that we partner with in each country, should be able to use this to kind of direct the conversation, to change the balance of power a little bit, right? And there's a lot of discussion about that. And the donor grantee relationship is a tricky one. But empowering people with data is a very good place to start in changing that power dynamic. So sort of trying to get people to rethink it. Because we did hear a lot of like, oh, well, we just have to collect this data for you. And we're like, no, that's not the right way to think about this.
That's great. And I think that point on the power dynamic, obviously there's a huge push in certain funders to do more locally led development. And one of the critical things that everyone needs to keep in mind is you need data, you need decision-making support, you can't just lead good decision making locally if you don't have access to the things you need to make good decisions, right? And so
Absolutely.
I feel like what you just said is so important, and something I feel like a lot of donors are skipping over, being like, oh yeah, we'll just do locally a lot of developments. Like, where's the infrastructure? Where's the support people are going to need to make good decisions locally, right? Just because the
Right.
decision made locally doesn't make it a good one.
I totally agree. And there's a lot of talk about trust-based philanthropy. Um, I think that works great if you have a local organization that has figured out what the metrics are. They have a way to report back on those. They've got reports in place and they generate reports so that they know what's going on, right? If that's not in place, this isn't going to go well. This is not an experiment that will go well. There will be a lot of money without having impact. And that isn't to say that these organizations can't get there. They just need some support, right? And they need help. We all do. We didn't start off with all of those things in place. We had to build them, and we had to get grants from Google to build them. It was expensive, and it took a lot of time and effort. And people have to recognize that that capacity needs to be built in order to have the impact that everybody's hoping.
And so you've scaled up, you've supported these partnerships, you've learned a ton, you continue to grow, and then you've also transitioned to your own personal role within the organization. So talk us through how that came to be and how that felt doing that and what it's like now.
Whew. Well, that could be an hour podcast on that whole process. I knew in my heart of hearts that success would be that MiracleFeet continued on without me, right? And yet, it's really hard to let go of something that you've built. And I had felt at many times that if I wasn't there holding this thing up, it wouldn't survive. And that was not a great feeling, right? I would wake up in the morning feeling kind of this sense of slight panic of like, how am I ever going to get out from this thing that I've now created? And it's amazingly rewarding. And it's the most fulfilling thing I've ever done. I love it. But boy, it's a lot of pressure and it's a lot of weight on my shoulders. And I've got to figure this out. And I just looked around and I had a number of really wise, very smart donors. And they were the ones who were kind of raising this, partly because they knew me as friends and they kind of saw the strain it was taking on my life and also sort of the sacrifices that I and my entire family were making. And they were kind of like, you know what, you're not going to be able to do this forever. And you do need to think about how you're going to hand this over. And so I started having the conversation with the board. And the more I talked about it, the more I realized this made sense, right? Even though there was a part of me that's like, but I really love this. And I'm kind of defining myself as the CEO of MiracleFeet. How am I going to let that go? What happens next? I did know rationally that it was something that had to happen. And so then we embarked on a process of sort of like, okay, well, I didn't feel like we had anybody on the team at the time that was kind of a natural successor. We had wonderful people, but that none of them, I don't think, actually wanted to do it or would have had the right collection of skills to be the right person to take it on. So we hired a headhunter and we do what people do. Of course, we launched it and then COVID happened. So that was tricky because we had to do the whole thing without meeting anybody in person. And we swore that we would absolutely not hire anyone unless we met them. But we weren't able to do that. So we brought somebody in, and the way we worked it to make sure that that person was the right person was they came in under me and reported to me for 2 years with a sort of very explicit understanding that if they liked MiracleFeet and we liked them, that at some point over some period of time yet to be defined, but somewhere between 2 and 4 years, they would take over as the CEO and I would step aside. So that, which was not easy to sort of come up with that process, and a lot of opinions on the right way to do it and the wrong way to do it. Some people felt really strongly that the founder needed to get the heck out of the way and that having that crossover period was a really bad idea. I couldn't imagine somebody kind of coming in and just doing it from zero, and that the learning, the sort of loss of institutional knowledge and the loss of especially the donor relationships would just be too much for this person to manage. And I think that was right. And I once our new CEO is Daphne Sorensen. She's fantastic. And she really kind of took over the programs first and did a great job of that. And I continued to be the person raising the money. And then when she became the CEO, I still stayed on and helped at a 50% level, kind of in an advisory role, and also raising the funds. And I'm now pretty much just on the board. There's about 10 donors that I still am the primary caretaker for, steward of those donors, because they're really friends and people that I knew before MiracleFeet, and I just want that to go well for everybody. So it's, but it has not been easy for me. I cannot pretend that I have enormous joy in that I no longer, that I have handed this on, and there is somebody who I have enormous confidence in. But it is not hard. It's not easy being on the sidelines. And no, there are lots of times where I'm like, I'd love to say something, and then like, no, keep your mouth shut. And occasionally I do say something, and then I regret it. So I've not been perfect, but I think MiracleFeet is in a really strong position. I'm very excited. We have been able to make the transition, and I'm now feeling really sort of liberated in like, wow, there's a lot of things I can look at and do. And I've dived into a whole bunch of things, all of which are pro bono, which is sort of experimentation on my side of how do I want to spend my time. And I'm not ready to just sit and do the gardening, although my garden's looking better. That's another upside. It's 13 years of neglect has been taken care of. So.
That's the garden's looking better should be a quote somewhere for what these transitions look like. But I think that's fascinating. So yeah, I would think most stereotypical advice for founder transition would be like, do not overlap that long. There's going to be this big power dynamic problem. Everybody's still going to run to you. So how did you support that? Because I do think the flip side is like, if you pick the wrong next person, it is catastrophic for the
Totally
organization.
catastrophic.
And so yes, that founder transition can be difficult, but equal downside of getting out quickly is like, if that's the wrong person, you are in a whole world of trouble. So how did that dynamic play out?
Messily. I think generally quite smoothly, in part because I had a really deep respect for the experience that Daphne, the person that we hired, brought to the table. And I felt that MiracleFeet was, I'm an entrepreneur. I love growing things. I really don't like putting policies in place and kind of doing the maintenance part. I love the shiny new thing, kind of the, what's the new innovation that we can bring in? What's the new country? And she is a much more patient, much kinder, gentler person than I am. And I think there's a real, I think that entrepreneurs share certain characteristics. And, you have to have such passion, such persistence, and sort of working at a level that you can't really expect anybody else to work at. And I knew that I kind of pushed the team beyond where people would be okay with for much longer, and that we needed someone else who could come in and do that. And I also knew that I don't find the sort of the policy piece and the more putting in place not the infrastructure, because there's a lot of infrastructure that needs to happen to create an organization that can be scaled, but the kind of the maintenance infrastructure, the policies about travel, I'm like, do we really need those? Like, but yeah, at some point you do. So I think I recognized that there were parts of the role that I no longer loved, and that I also wasn't that very good at. And it was lovely to have somebody else who was much better at it than me do those things and get them off my plate. So there was sort of, some things I really missed, but other things I was very happy to go on. I mean, you get stale after a while. I think, I was there 13 years. That's a long time under one person. I'm still around if anyone has questions. I go to the board meetings. I pay a huge amount of attention. I mean, I love it, right?
And I think it's such a struggle because there's a ton of social entrepreneurs that I talk with, that mentor me, that I mentor, that, are friends or colleagues, and burnout's a huge issue, among them. Everybody who's a founder, their entire identity is wrapped up in their role and the success of their organization. You're never even close to finished, so it's not like there's an end point. And, it's so important to recognize when your skills are aligned with the organization, needs right now, and then when you've either outgrown the organization or the organization's outgrown you, right? And
Yeah.
if you hold on too long, it's a recipe for both burnout and like poor performance, either by
Yeah. And
yourself
kind
or
of a
by the
sad
organization.
end, right? Like,
That's right.
yeah. Yeah. But it's not easy. I would not, everyone said it was going to be difficult. I was like, no. We've got this figured out. Daphne and I get on so well. It'll be fine. And sure enough, there've been moments where it's like, oh boy, this is what everyone's talking about. I get it now.
Yeah. I really appreciate you sharing a bit about that, Chesca, because I think as you've been sharing, the thing I'm reflecting on is that's so important to the sustainability and the long-term impact of this organization, right? So, and it's also just so human. And I love that you kind of reflecting on how you're able to kind of bring in your strengths and sort of follow where your strengths are and where you want to be spending your energy, and sort of being able to shift your sort of role within the organization based on that too.
I'm
curious.
Made it sound a lot cleaner than it was.
That's the beauty of storytelling, right?
You're on a podcast. You're allowed to spin the story however sounds the best.
Yeah, storytelling. It's what it's all about, right?
Exactly.
Absolutely.
And so now that you've had, what is by any reasonable definition, an amazingly successful journey, are you considering starting something again? Do you want to play more, across are you going to stay within Clubfoot? Are you like, one of the really interesting exits I've seen of some founders is to then play more at a level above their organization to try to help the entire field move in a certain direction. And so that's one thing I've seen. And I'm just curious, what is resonating with you right now, and what are you excited about?
Yeah. So I don't think part of the problem of playing a role within Clubfoot, I have thought about that, and I may come back to that. I haven't completely ruled that out, but MiracleFeet is by far the largest piece of that. And it's almost like it wouldn't be far enough away from MiracleFeet for me to be effective, and people would see me. The other organizations that are sort of working on Clubfoot are much smaller, and definitely we're a little bit of the 800-pound gorilla. And so then having me come in and be on top of all of that, it's like more MiracleFeet, really? Even though I would think I could be impartial and not be kind of like representing MiracleFeet. So that is a little bit tricky. But what I'm really enjoying, and I think is the space that I'm most interested in playing in, I'm currently mentoring the founders / CEOs of 4 small organizations that are much earlier stage. They're all working in global health. They all happen to be in Africa, and really just sort of being there to advise someone else who's, got a fantastic idea. They've got the organization in place, and they're trying to figure out what do they need to solve next. And I think as someone who's been through that, I didn't know what I didn't know until you get there. And so I'm kind of pointing out, particularly in 2 of these organizations, kind of like, okay, you're doing a fabulous job of this, but now you really need to work on your board, or now you really need to work on your pitch deck, or now you need to do this. And I'm finding that without a huge amount of, this is going to sound bad, without a huge amount of effort on my part, I can be incredibly helpful with things that seem really not very deep or intellectually important, but they're just kind of like, oh, well, this is how we solve this. This may not work for you, but there's this, and this, and this, think about all of those different perspectives. And the feedback is really, really positive. That it's like, oh my goodness, it would have taken me weeks to figure that out, but you've just told me the format I need, or you've given me a template I can use, or you've given me the 3 things I need to think about as I put together, my board and make sure that I've got the right group in the room. I'm finding, and maybe people are just being nice, but I'm feeling like I'm really making a difference, and it's very relevant to the people I'm working with, and very helpful, and quite efficient and quick. And so it's really kind of adding value in a pretty easy way for both sides. So what I'm trying to figure out is if there's a way to kind of institutionalize that. And well,
it's important that it's quick, because your garden probably still needs some help.
The garden, yeah. And I'm also in better physical shape, so I'm doing a lot of exercise too. Those 2 things are very good for my mental health.
Those 2 things you're bringing up, though, I think are, I think they're part of the job of a young CEO. One is taking care of yourself, so you have the energy day in and day out to come to work and be in the right mental space and capacity. But the other is to seek out mentorship from people. And I was too slow on this early in my career, and it would have accelerated my understanding of organizational dynamics and certain things that I hadn't previously experienced. But I think that's so, it's exactly what I would expect that you're experiencing is your wisdom and your learnings from, building a successful enterprise are immediately transferable very quickly because you can pattern match. Oh, I saw that happen in my organization,
Right.
or
Right.
I know exactly
Or
what you're
we
going
screwed
through.
that up. And this is,
Exactly.
so don't do this.
Yeah.
I am finding that if I keep it within global health too, I think because we worked with public hospitals, and that's a very complicated thing to do, and a lot of organizations trying to tackle global health, by default, you sort of have to work with government hospitals because that's where most people get their healthcare. And so that knowledge of what that dynamic is like, I think allows me to be that much more helpful. And I think, so I do think there is some sort of subject matter grounding that's helpful to match up. I think if I was trying to help somebody with a agricultural and social enterprise, I would be less helpful. So
That's
it
great.
is relevant broadly, but I think sticking to sort of global health makes it even more impactful.
And that's fascinating. I hadn't put that together, but I think that is extremely unique advice one could seek from you around that relationship you had with those public hospitals. Because you were, in fact, you were funding the procedures, right? So you would fundraise and then support some of the ability for them, maybe not directly or indirectly, but that $500 that goes to treat a child, you're helping the hospital actually earn revenue by doing so.
No,
No?
we actually
Okay.
weren't. The $500 went to all the programmatic pieces that went around the hospital.
Got it. Okay.
We did not pay the providers, the healthcare providers, because they were all government employees and they're being paid by the government. So we did not want to sort of add a weird incentive for them to treat Clubfoot, so that if we had to ever pull out, which we've never had to do, but eventually we'll leave, we want them to continue to do it. So we were using government facilities, so the space, we never built any infrastructure. And then the healthcare providers who were actually putting the casts on were all paid for by the government. But we provided all the training, we provided all the M&E tools, we provided the braces, we provided any other materials that weren't there. And then we did a lot around, because nobody had ever treated Clubfoot, families, there's an enormous amount of education and awareness raising that has to go on across the country, so that a family that has a kid with Clubfoot is told, okay, this isn't a problem, this is where you go. Instead of being told, oh, this is not treatable, you should just hide your child forever, or this will self-correct, which, neither of those lead to a solution. So the programmatic piece wrapped around the clinic is pretty important. So I would say the $500 gets spread out between materials for the treatment, support in the clinic for parent counseling and follow-up, but not the actual doctor, the braces, and then the rest of it is kind of the programmatic, making sure that we're capturing all the kids that get into the clinics at a young age.
Chesca, I'm curious to hear you reflect on your ability to focus. Like, as I hear MiracleFeet's story, I think about like, wow, it was incredible that you were able to choose this one really important thing and just laser focus on it. And then I also have the thought of like, oh, well, you've got this incredible network set up. Like, are there other interventions that MiracleFeet could be thinking about getting into? How did you think about that as MiracleFeet?
That was suggested frequently by many different people that, well, could you help with hip dysplasia or other orthopedic issues? And for the most part, the systems that we put in place really didn't apply very well to other conditions. So Clubfoot is one of the few conditions that a pediatric orthopedic surgeon can actually solve. Most pediatric orthopedic conditions, unfortunately, are things that the child is going to live with, and the doctor's trying to make them more comfortable. So things like spina bifida and cerebral palsy, and that have orthopedic components to them, neurological, but also orthopedic, there are syndromes, and we see those kids because actually a bunch of those kids have Clubfoot as well, weirdly. So things like arthrogryposis, and the fixability of this sort of made it very easy to kind of take to the side and say, okay, this is one we can solve, so everyone can get behind it and we can just take care of it. The other things required a lifelong support of those families, and it was sort of a different, equally needy. I mean, maybe more needy, but much, much, much harder. And the technical skills of the doctors are very different and much harder to train. This Clubfoot is this weird little package with, it's non-surgical. You can train a physical therapist to do it just as well as an orthopedic surgeon. In fact, most of our treatment in Africa is certainly done by physical therapists and not by orthopedic surgeons, because there are so few orthopedic surgeons. That's a bit different in Southeast Asia and Latin America. But we looked at it quite often, and we just, in the end, we decided we just wouldn't be very good at it. And that part of the donor appeal, but also the fact that the programs were so effective, was because it was so focused. But that was hard to do because the world doesn't like that. The funding world, the big funding world, is looking for this, broad health systems change, which if anybody can define that for me and convince me that anybody actually knows what that means, I would be really happy. Because I think what we're doing is health systems change. It just happens to be this way and not that way. But everything we're doing this way contributes to many other things. So if we're out looking for kids with Clubfoot and we find a kid with spina bifida or with hip dysplasia, we're going to make sure that kid gets to the hospital and gets referred. So there's skill sets that we are putting in place that help very broadly. And even changing the way people view disability, helps, contributes. The way doctors are collecting information and using information, they're going to take that to other things. So I would argue that we're absolutely we're strengthening health systems, but, we're really, really good at it within Clubfoot, and that's valuable. But when you talk to some of the larger organizations, there are sort of a number of them where we wouldn't qualify to get funds from them because they really only want to work abroad. I mean, the good news is you need both. So if they're funding that and other people are funding the verticals, which way? Vertical, horizontal. Yeah, we're in the vertical, they're in the horizontal. There are different donors for different pieces. So eventually it all gets done. Ideally, we'd like to actually pack up and go home at some point, right? I mean, and that's one of the arguments is if we can build this capacity and we can normalize it and we can make this something that is just routinely treatable in a public hospital, and all the materials are there, then you don't need MiracleFeet anymore, and that's a beautiful thing, right?
I was wondering about that. Like, what does that ideal future state look like?
And do you have like kind of a, the same way you talked about quality and the steps for treating an individual Clubfoot case, do you have like, these are the milestones we want to see a particular country be able to go through to be off our
independent
list?
Right, exactly. We do intellectually, but we have yet to actually really make much progress in getting anybody off the payroll, so to speak. I think that's really our next challenge. We talk about it all the time. This is no pun intended, the Achilles heel of what we do, is that it really ought to be mainstreamed, and it wouldn't cost the government that much to take it on because it's so cheap to treat. It's plaster of Paris. The only real extra expense are the braces. And that's something that we could continue to provide low-cost braces if that was what was needed. But we are starting to push. We've identified 3 or 4 countries where we have a really strong relationship with the Ministry of Health, and they understand the importance of this. They've seen the progress that we've made. And so we're trying to work with them to map out what are the stages. What pieces of this could you take on that we would no longer have to fund? It's yet to really happen. I mean, they've done some things that are nice, but don't take cost out of the system. So, for example, they've developed guidelines for Clubfoot, and they've agreed that Clubfoot is something that midwives should be added to the list of things that midwives are trained to do, and part of their list of responsibilities is identifying and referring kids with Clubfoot. That doesn't take that much out of our cost structure, right? So we're still training the midwives on that, and then we've never paid them to do it. And a really good example, and one that I feel should be doable, although again we haven't got a great example. We've had some governments say they're going to do it, but it's never actually happened. Which is to take the training that we use and integrate that into the curriculum of the physical therapists and the medical schools, so that when doctors and physical therapists are coming out of college, they're already trained in the Ponseti method. And they might need a little bit of extra training, but at least they'd have the basics, right? And again, government, we can give them the curriculum. They've got people in medical school. They're just making the time available to make this part of what they teach. That's, those are the kinds of things that I'm frustrated we haven't been able to get anybody to actually step up and do, but we're pushing pretty hard. And I think that, one of the things that Daphne brings is much more experience working on the policy side and the advocacy side. And so she's focused more time and energy and investment on that. And I'm hoping that we'll see some results.
That's great. And I think that's an upstream exit strategy, to use the terrible term that we use in our industry, that I haven't ever heard somebody propose, of like, we'll go to the medical schools, teach them how to do the thing we're teaching everybody to do, and then they'll know it forever because it'll be part of the curriculum. Right. And then we never have to train people again because
nobody else has suggested that. That seems so
I can't remember anybody having said that as the exit to currently. I'm just like thinking off the top of my head, but no, I mean, I think it's
and I mean, to be fair, it's not the only thing that has to happen, right?
Right.
I mean, there's many things, but it's one little piece, right? And we spend a lot of money on training, so that would take real cost out of what we do. And other things that we're doing, like, training midwives, training maternity hospitals, training rural health clinics, that, how to identify Clubfoot, which is not difficult, and where to refer people. That I feel like it takes a fair amount of investment in the early stages, but eventually that just sort of becomes self-fulfilling, right? So you build it in and you don't have to keep going back to do that. There's sort of some tipping point where it's like, oh yeah, everybody knows that Clubfoot's treatable, right? Of course it is. Yeah. And so you'd think that you could start reducing costs. We have yet to see it, in part because we do focus a lot of time and energy on making sure that we're reaching kids in rural areas. So we go to the easy places first, and then the harder places, which we go to later, cost more because they're further away from the centers. You're working usually with less skilled healthcare professionals. The families live further away. Everything, they're probably less educated. There's less public transport. All the problems just get that much harder as you go deeper into rural areas. So you end up sort of going up in cost instead of down. You think scale, right? Like, okay, we got economies of scale, and all the costs will come down. And then you're like, oh, I forgot that it takes 7 hours to get there, and that adds some cost.
Before you started MiracleFeet, it looks like you had experience in product management. And as you were describing some of the ways that you've been using CommCare and building this CAST app within MiracleFeet, it brought to mind like that sort of attitude of like you were building a tech product to help drive the organization. And I'm curious to hear, one, if that resonates to you, and two, like, how did you go about building that capacity and function within MiracleFeet to sort of continue to leverage technology in innovative and new ways, right? Because one of the things John and I talk a lot about is you can't just set up technology and walk away from it, right? You need to be continually investing in it, improving it, and adding more value. So curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think I definitely believe very strongly that all of the things I did in the business world prior to starting working on Clubfoot issue really, really helped me. They were skills that I applied in the nonprofit world. And I think a lot of people who start nonprofits come from the nonprofit world and don't have that. And I think we sort of, in some ways, we looked different in that I think we've always run this more like a business, or with a sort of business mentality. And I think, the product management part of my resume or my experiences were all in early stage internet companies. So it was less kind of like product marketing in a traditional P&G kind of way, and much more about technology. And the internet was just starting, and everyone was trying to figure out how the heck we use this thing. And eToys was one of the early, that was right at the time that Amazon started. We know who won that one, but it was so. My experience coming into MiracleFeet was very tech heavy, and I was very energized and excited by that. And I also sort of learned what starting a new organization was all about, how exciting that was, and how much I loved that world. So I definitely brought all of that with me. I think that also the management consulting that I'd done 4 years with BCG was really, really helpful, because sort of the analytical side of it just came naturally, and the kind of creating the frameworks and thinking about how do you scale this and what does that, that kind of breaking down the problem into manageable pieces and describable pieces, I think was very helpful. Most of the people on the board were business people at at the beginning. And that also helped. So one great example is we were really struggling with the braces. And this was the first product that we came up with ourselves in-house. Well, not completely in-house, but by which we created, or we solved that problem. And we looked at the ways we were trying to solve the problem of braces, which was to buy really bad locally made ones that were custom made and very expensive and not high quality. And it was really hard to scale that. So every time we would go to a country, we'd be like, oh, now we got to find someone who can make a brace, and that's like a whole new problem. Or by recycling old braces. And that was terrible because they would be broken, or it was the wrong, you'd get one shoe that was a size 3 and a size 4, and you were trying to piece it together and you'd have to ship them. So we had this terrible solutions. And the board just sat there and like, this isn't very complicated. It's just a bar with a pair of shoes on it. Why can't we make one? And I think that's not the way most nonprofits think. I think we all, it was like, okay, here's a hurdle, here's a problem. We're not going to go around it. We're going to solve it, and then we'll be able to move forward. And I think we did that. We've done that many times. And I really do think that's a more business. I think that comes more naturally to people who've worked in the business environment, because that's how you win, is by solving the problems better than, in a better way, right? And I think a lot of nonprofits work around things. So I think, I don't know if I've answered your question, but I do really believe, and maybe it was because I didn't have the clinical background. I didn't have the how do you build a nonprofit background. I didn't have the medical background. So all I knew was to kind of apply these business concepts. That was sort of what I did, because I didn't know what else to do when I sat down at my kitchen table on the first day of saying, okay, this is what I'm going to do. And I don't know how to do it. I don't have anyone to help me. I sort of went business on it. I went management consulting on it and tried to break the problem down and talk, do lots of interviews and talk to lots of people and then bounce it off lots of people until it got something on paper that everybody was like, oh, well, maybe that'll work. So I think I really do credit my business background in helping me be successful with MiracleFeet. I don't think that's the only way. I think, there's so many different ways, but for me, that was all I had. So I sort of had to use it. And then in the places where that didn't work, I had to bring in people who had that expertise. So obviously you build the rest of it around you with the people that you bring. But it was very appealing. When we talked about how we ran MiracleFeet, that really appealed to the kind of donors that we attracted. A lot of them would say, what I love about this is you run it like a business. And your bottom line is feet and not money. But that's the way you're thinking about it. You're trying to optimize for that all the time.
That's awesome. Well, you've been so generous with your time, and this was awesome to get to.
It's been fun.
Chat much more deeply. Yeah, I appreciate you coming on, and really look forward to whatever ends up, on your plate next, and we'll be cheering you on.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I'll probably be knocking on your door asking for advice. So it's not, it won't be the last you hear of me, probably, or I hope not anyway. But thank you so much for letting me talk and having great questions and sharing a little bit of the MiracleFeet story. Really appreciate it.
A huge thank you to Chesca for joining us today. I'll share a couple of reflections. On a personal note, the things that really stand out to me, one, Chesca's ability to really listen to herself. In some of those really pivotal moments, she was able to tune into her gut instincts and decide to follow them and listen to them. And she, of course, backed it up with lots of data and analysis. But I think that ability to really tune into yourself is such an asset. I also want to commend her ability to focus. She really chose one problem. She fell in love with that problem, and she made incredible progress on that problem. The next reflection I wanted to share was really about how does this tie into how Demagi sees technology in global health and development. And so you've heard us talk on this podcast and elsewhere about impact delivery. So impact delivery is our approach to leveraging technology that allows you to get more impact, better impact, and sustained impact with the same amount of resources, because we know that every organization out there is facing incredible resource constraints. And we believe firmly in raising the bar on what's possible with technology. So first, let's unpack better impact. What we mean by better impact is you're able to use technology to support you in collecting data from your programs, but that same technology can also be used to improve the service delivery. And that's what we heard Chesca talk about, where she was able to use CommCare to collect information about those 4 quality metrics and ensure that they were delivering high quality services, but that same application was also making the providers' jobs better and allowing them to do their jobs better. On the more impact side, you heard Chesca talk about scaling. They scaled to 34 countries at this moment, and they've been able to deliver these services to almost 100,000 kids. And then lastly, she talks about sustained impact and a few different ways that they're thinking about that. One is about thinking about how can this program become part of the government health system in the countries where they work. Another is how she's thinking about her transition, right? She was really thoughtful about having a successor come into the organization, learn, and being able to hand off that role of CEO so that the organization could be sustainable. That's our show. Please like, rate, review, subscribe. This show is executive produced by myself. Sarah Strauss is our editor. Michael Kelleher is our producer. And cover art is by Sudhanshu Kant.